There are places in Scotland that still appear on maps, marked with names, given coordinates, printed in atlases, listed in county records. And yet, nobody goes there. Nobody explains why. And if you ask someone local, they'll give you an answer that doesn't quite answer anything. This isn't a video about ghosts. It isn't about folklore or legends or things that go bump in the Highland dark. It's about something stranger than that. It's about places where the fear is completely rational, because it comes from something that actually happened, from decisions that were actually made, from silences that were very deliberately kept. 12 villages, 12 layers of a Scotland that was buried, not by time, but by design. Let's start at the surface and work our way down. Number 12. You come over a rise in the landscape somewhere in the Western Highlands, and there it is. A village. Stone walls, a track, the outline of fields, and nothing else. No sound, no movement, not even the usual sheep wandering through abandoned places like they own them. Just walls and wind and that particular quality of light that the west coast of Scotland does, gray and golden at the same time somehow. This is the kind of place you photograph before you understand it, before you realize the silence isn't peaceful. It's pointed. The village had a name. It had families. It had a way of life built around the land and the sea over the course of several hundred years. Then, at some point in the early 19th century, it stopped, not because the land ran out, not because disease swept through, but because someone decided, in an office somewhere, that this particular piece of ground was worth more without the people on it. The clearances, the systematic displacement of Highland communities to make way for sheep farming, and later deer hunting estates, didn't always make the history books in any detail. The economics did. The aristocratic landowners did. The people, mostly, didn't. What remained were the walls, and they're still there now, waiting as abandoned buildings always seem to wait for something that isn't coming back. This is the beginning of a pattern. 12 places in. By the time we reach number 1, you'll understand what the pattern is. Number 11. On the outskirts of Inverness, close enough to the city that you might expect the land to have been absorbed into something newer, there are the remains of a settlement that local historians struggle to find in the official record. Not because it was small, but because at some point someone made sure it wasn't easy to find. During the height of the clearances, landlords didn't only remove people from the land. Some of them removed the evidence of having done so. Parish records disappeared, estate maps were redrawn, the people relocated, often to coastal strips of land too poor to sustain them or onto emigrant ships, and the paperwork that might have documented their removal was quietly retired. This settlement near Inverness housed a community that worked in various forms of agricultural labor. When they were displaced, the landowner had the structures partially demolished. Not completely. That would have taken effort. Just enough to discourage the question of who had lived there and for how long. The descendants of those families are still in the area. Some of them. They carry a specific kind of knowledge. The knowledge that your history is real even when the records say it isn't. That knowledge has its own weight. Inverness has grown comfortable around this absence, the way cities often do. The land was eventually absorbed. A road runs nearby now, but under that road, and this is a strange thing to say and also entirely accurate, are the foundations of a community that the official history of the region chose not to remember. Number 10. The Shetland Islands sit so far north that on most printed maps of Britain they appear in a small inset box, tucked into a corner of the North Sea as an afterthought. There is something appropriate about that marginality. In one of the more remote areas of the archipelago, there was a family. A single extended family that had occupied the same stretch of coastline across multiple generations. Fisherfolk, primarily. People whose calendar was built around the sea, whose social world was dense and self-contained, whose relationship with the land was ancient in the way that relationships with specific parcels of ground can become ancient when they last long enough. Then, across a single generation, they were gone. Not in a dramatic way, no recorded catastrophe, no epidemic in the parish register. Just a pattern of departure, relocation, death, that left no one behind. The last member of the family to live in the area died in the 1890s and was buried in a churchyard where the headstone has since become illegible. There is no agreed explanation for what happened. There are theories: economic hardship, the pressure of landlord consolidation, the particular vulnerability of island communities when the fishing trade shifted. But none of them fully account for the completeness of the disappearance. Shetland holds this story lightly, the way it holds a lot of things. The islands are practiced at enduring. The wind doesn't allow for sentimentality. But somewhere on that coastline, there's a place where a family's world used to be, and no one is entirely sure what ended it. Number 9. The Scottish borders. The stretch of country between Edinburgh and England has a reputation for a particular kind of beauty. Green hills, rivers, market towns with long memories. What the tourist literature tends to skip is this. In the late 17th century, this region was the site of some of the most intense witch trial activity in Britain. And the accused, in a disproportionate number of cases, shared a particular characteristic. They owned land that someone else wanted. In a village along the borders, the name is in the records for those who know where to look, a series of women were accused of witchcraft in the 1670s and 1680s. The accusations followed a pattern that historians of the period recognize. The women were independent, owned property, refused to surrender it, and had no male protector to argue their case. The trials proceeded. Some were executed, others fled. The land passed to new hands. The village itself continued, grew even, but it grew in a direction that quietly forgot what had preceded it. The women weren't memorialized. The original properties were absorbed into larger estates. The community that replaced the one that had been dismantled through judicial process simply moved on. There are descendants of those women alive today in the borders, though the connection is rarely spoken of. The knowledge lives in family memory rather than public history. The village is still there. It has a church, a post office probably. It looks from the outside entirely normal. That's the thing about places where violent injustice happened a long time ago. They look entirely normal. Number 8. The Cairngorm Plateau. The high ancient massif in the center of the Scottish Highlands is, in geological terms, some of the oldest ground in Britain. It has a permanence to it, a sense that it will outlast most things. Which makes it strange that a community once living in its lower valleys was, in the Victorian period, not merely displaced, but actively buried. A drainage and land improvement project in the 1860s redirected watercourses across a stretch of the Cairngorm foothills. The engineering was ambitious for its time. It transformed boggy, marginal ground into productive farmland. It was celebrated in the agricultural press of the era. What wasn't celebrated, wasn't mentioned, in fact, was the community that had farmed the margins of that bog for generations. They were agricultural laborers, essentially, not landowners. Their occupation of the land was precarious, depending on the tolerance of whoever held the estate. When the drainage works began, they were removed. Their structures, the low turf and stone buildings typical of the period, were incorporated into the earthworks, literally buried under the new landscape. Their descendants live in the region still. There has never been an official acknowledgement of what happened to their community or where. Somewhere beneath the managed farmland of the Cairngorm foothills, under the improved fields and the drainage channels, there are the remains of a way of life that the Victorian Improvement Project decided wasn't worth working around. The ground doesn't know it's supposed to have forgotten. Number 7. Skye is the kind of island that photographers love. The Cuillins, the Quiraing, the ruins that punctuate the green hillsides like punctuation marks in a language you almost understand. But there's a particular village on the island, one that appears in 18th century records, that features in a handful of oral histories, that local people will sometimes mention and sometimes won't, where something in the documentary record goes quiet for a significant period. Not 1 or 2 years, decades. Parish records from the 18th century are imperfect things. They were kept by ministers who were human, who missed entries, who moved on and left gaps. That kind of absence can be explained, but in this case, the gap is specific. It covers a period that local oral tradition associates with a particular conflict between the fishing community who lived there and the interests of the estate that controlled the surrounding land. The exact nature of that conflict has been debated. What isn't debated is that the community contracted dramatically during that period, and that the contraction coincided with pressure from above. What remains in living memory, passed through families in the way that island communities pass things, is a sense that the first night in that village is disturbed, not haunted, nothing so neat, just restless. Like sleeping in a room where someone was once very upset, and the walls remember it in their way. That's not the supernatural. That's history, sitting in the atmosphere of a place, refusing to fully evaporate. Number 6. Loch Ness has been thoroughly colonized by a myth. The monster, the sonar expeditions, the blurry photographs, the gift shops. But along the southern shore of the loch, away from the tourist infrastructure that clusters around the northern end, there are ruins that have nothing to do with any of that. They are the remains of a community that existed during the period of the Jacobite uprisings, the series of armed conflicts in the 17th and 18th centuries that attempted to restore the Stuart monarchy to the British throne. The community's misfortune was geographical. They occupied ground that changed hands multiple times during the conflicts, and they made the mistake of being ordinary people in the path of armies. The ruins aren't marked with information boards. They aren't part of any heritage trail. They predate the monster myth by centuries, and the monster myth, in its cheerful commerciality, has comprehensively overshadowed them. What happened there during the Jacobite period isn't precisely documented. The area saw violence. Communities in the path of punitive military expeditions, particularly those that followed the final defeat at Culloden in 1746, suffered reprisals that often weren't recorded in any official capacity. The loch holds its silence well. It always has, and the ruins on its southern shore exist in the shadow of a story so famous that nobody looks at anything else. Number 5. Roslin is famous now, in a particular way. The chapel, the conspiracy theories, the tourists who arrive having read a certain novel, looking for encrypted meaning in stone carvings. What they're mostly not looking for is the village nearby, or what was a village, before a century of religious and political pressure reshaped it almost entirely. In the decades following the Scottish Reformation of the 16th century, the imposition of Presbyterian orthodoxy on Highland and Lowland communities alike was not a gentle process. Communities that had maintained pre-Christian practices, often absorbed into a form of folk Catholicism, layered over older observances, found themselves under sustained pressure to conform. Near Roslin, there was a community that had maintained a graveyard whose markers were, by any reasonable assessment, pre-Christian in origin. The markers recorded a set of beliefs, a set of practices, a set of relationships between the living and the dead that the Presbyterian Church found unacceptable. The markers were removed, systematically, over a period of years. The graveyard is still there, but it's a graveyard stripped of its memory. The people buried there have no legible memorial. The stones that might have told you who they were and what they believed were taken away, and in most cases have never been located. The chapel up the hill gets the visitors. The graveyard gets the grass. Number 4. This one is different, not because what happened was more violent, though it may have been, but because the mechanism of forgetting was administrative rather than accidental. In the Highlands, there is a village whose name was removed from official maps at some point in the 19th century. Not omitted through oversight, removed. The reason appears to be connected to an incident involving the family that owned the surrounding estate. The precise nature of the incident isn't publicly documented, which is, of course, exactly the point. What is documented in estate records that have been partially examined by local historians is a sudden change in the way the land is described. A new name given to the area. The old name absent from subsequent surveys. Local people continued to use the original name for several generations. It appears in letters, in diaries, in the occasional mention in church records. But it was never reinstated on any official document. The family that owned the estate are gone now. The estate itself was broken up in the early 20th century, but the name, the original name of the place, exists in a kind of limbo, known to some, unrecognized by any official geography. There is a particular kind of power in the ability to rename a place. It is, in the end, a form of erasure. The landscape remains, but the name that attached it to a community, to a history, to a set of specific events, that can be taken away. And once it's gone long enough, very few people remember to ask what it was. Number 3. The Orkney Islands lie north of the Scottish mainland, separated by the Pentland Firth, one of the most treacherous stretches of water in Britain. There was a fishing community on one of the islands that, at some point in the early 19th century, contracted dramatically and then disappeared. The local historical record contains a partial account of an epidemic, something respiratory, apparently, spreading through the close quarters of a fishing village with speed and severity. The British government has no official record of this epidemic. That absence has attracted academic attention over the years. It is, on its face, unusual. The period in question saw increasing public health documentation across Britain. Orkney's distance from London might explain some gaps, but the specific and complete absence of any government record of an event that, by local account, killed a significant portion of a community is not easily explained by distance alone. The most plausible explanation, and the one that local historians tend to return to, is that documentation wasn't absent, but destroyed. That a record existed and was removed. Why that might have happened isn't clear. What is clear is this: a community of fishing families lived on that island. They were, by all available local accounts, a community in the full sense, with their own practices, their own economy, their own way of relating to the sea. Then they were gone, and the government, officially, doesn't know why. That silence has never been adequately explained. And on an island that size, in a community that close-knit, silence like that doesn't happen by accident. Number 2. Glencoe. If you know one thing about Scottish history, there's a reasonable chance it's this. In February of 1692, soldiers acting under government orders killed 38 members of the MacDonald clan in the valley of Glencoe. They had been guests. They were killed in their beds. The massacre of Glencoe is one of the most documented atrocities in Scottish history. It has been written about, memorialized, argued over. It is, in the tourism literature, almost a point of pride, a testament to the persistence of Scottish historical memory. But there is a smaller settlement on the margins of Glencoe, close enough to have been within earshot of what happened that February night, that doesn't appear in the official account of the massacre. The people who lived there weren't MacDonalds, and so they don't feature in the primary narrative. But they were there, and they witnessed something. And what they witnessed, and what happened to them in the weeks that followed, as the soldiers remained in the area and the government attempted to manage the fallout from what had been done, is almost entirely absent from the record. Tour guides who work the Glencoe area are, by and large, reluctant to stay there overnight. This is a thing that is said semi-jokingly in the industry. Like most things said semi-jokingly, it contains something real. There are places where the weight of what happened is not distributed evenly, where the official memorial doesn't cover the full perimeter of the wound. Glencoe is one of those places. The settlement on its edge is another. Number 1. On the Outer Hebrides, on one of the long islands that trail off the northwest coast of Scotland like an afterthought of the mainland, there are houses still standing. Not ruins. Houses. Walls intact. Roofs gone mostly, but the structures themselves holding. Stone built well enough to outlast the reason for its building. These houses belong to a community that was removed in the 19th century as part of a program of assisted emigration. The landlord paid the passage, and the families were put on ships bound for Cape Breton, for Prince Edward Island, for the eastern seaboard of Canada. The landlord called this generosity. The people who were removed called it something else. Many of them never stopped calling it home, here. This particular valley. These particular walls. The oral tradition in the Cape Breton communities that received them is remarkably specific. The names of fields, the names of neighbors, the names of bays and headlands in a language, Scottish Gaelic, that the islands of Canada do not have. They carried a geography with them across the Atlantic, and they kept it alive for generations against all practical reason. Some of their descendants have come back. Stood in front of the walls of houses their great-great-grandparents were removed from, spoken Gaelic in a place that their family spoke Gaelic, in an unbroken line, for however many centuries before the ships. The houses are still standing. The people who built them were told, in the language of 19th century estate management, that they were an inefficiency, that the land was more valuable without them, that this was progress. Progress left the walls standing. The walls are still waiting. And somewhere between those walls and the Canadian coastline where their builders ended up, in that space of loss and displacement and refusal to entirely forget, is the real geography of Scotland, not the one on the maps, the one that lives in the people the maps left out. Every place in this countdown was, at one point, someone's entire world. Every silence was once full of voices. Every gap in the record was, at some point, a decision someone made. The heather grows back over everything. The stone endures. The mist comes in off the Atlantic, the way it always has. But underneath the mist, if you know what you're looking for, Scotland remembers, whether it wants to or not.